The main console room was dark. Given the recent changes to its decor, this was no mean feat. An almost universal dose of brilliant white had an amazing ability to capture and reflect even the smallest illumination. Yet somehow, the Doctor had managed to reduce the place to an inky gloom. He had killed all the internal illumination possible. There were still a few scattered indicator bulbs on the main console, which could not be extinguished, and it was these which provided what little light remained. Feeble as it was, it could still be seen that the central column was totally still and only visible through reflections upon its faces. The whole room seemed to be rocking very gently, like a tugboat at anchor, or possibly even adrift. A crashing, jangling, raucous E minor chord blasted out into the night-shrouded cavernous space. On the floor, one leg flat, the other bent, sat the 12th Doctor, his back against the main console. His right hand listlessly continued past the strings of his electric guitar to arc half-heartedly into the air just above his head. He let the hand fall now onto those strings again with a left-hand muted crunch, before sliding the pick down the fretboard while simultaneously shifting his left fingers up to around the 12th fret. Now positioned, he began to play a heavily distorted, slow refrain. It was bluesy, but of the most tortured sort, and if anything, most closely resembled Hendrix's Banner. As the screaming notes wove and twisted around the Doctor and spun their way into the far reaches of the room, their blackened, ironic melody was revealed. It was the Ode to Joy. The song ended with an ascending staircase of chords, the final one wailing off to die in a corner somewhere. Eventually all had faded back to silence. The silence was broken by a one-person round of applause. The Doctor sat bolt upright, staring around wildly for the source of the noise. Failing to locate it in his first frantic second of searching, he leapt straight to his feet, guitar still clutched in his hands, almost as if he were about to wield it as a weapon. Some distance away, across the other side of the main console and beyond it, almost to the wall, was the vague silhouette of a person. "How did you get here? Who are you?" the Doctor demanded loudly. A woman's voice floated out from the darkness.
"Oh, you know who I am, Doctor,"
it said with a hint of gentle laughter.
"and it would hardly be the first time I've broken into the TARDIS."
"TARDIS! Lights!" the Doctor barked. Suddenly the main console room was fully illuminated, leaving the Doctor wincing painfully as his eyes adjusted to the blinding light. The woman now revealed was also blinking, but with less obvious irritation than the Doctor. He was certain he had never seen that face before, and yet there was a familiarity about it, a connection, almost a bond. But for now he could not explain it. The face was strong and beautiful. Dark eyes, full lips, ageless. If she were human, she could be anywhere from 25 to 45. This timeless face was framed by long dark hair, most of which was tied up in a semi-formal arrangement on top of her head, with a few strategic strands left dangling. It was her clothing, however, which first began tugging at the Doctor's distant and often erratic memories, pushing far from concrete flashes of recognition to mind. She wore a long cream evening dress, slit subtly and somewhat modestly, yet undeniably to the thigh. Clever folds hid the upper leg, but the way she stood revealed one of a pair of above-the-knee cream leather boots, heeled, but not impractically so. Finally, the Doctor's vague and jumbled memories spun and melded to form a name. "Romana?" the Doctor asked, even now his voice betraying his doubts.
"Who else?"
Romana replied with a smile. The Doctor instantly straightened up from his defensive stance, swinging the guitar into one hand before leaning it against the main console in one fluid action. He then swiftly brushed his clothes a couple of times, presumably in his mind to restore them to a presentable appearance. "It seems you've regenerated since last we met," he said somewhat stiffly.
"You know how it is. The body gets tired, or one gets tired of the body. Same old, same old."
The Doctor still looked a little standoffish. "Well, I suppose it's nice to see an unfamiliar face." Romana chuckled.
"Now, Doctor, it's not like I always choose to wear someone else's face. Besides which, you are hardly one to talk."
The Doctor harumphed at this and stuffed his hands into his pockets. "I'd heard you'd retired," he stated, attempting to change the subject.
"I certainly tried. Running around with you, then running Gallifrey, it's enough to exhaust any Time Lord, even one nearly half a millennium younger than you." The
Doctor sniffed airily. Are you sure that our respective timelines are still that far apart, age-wise? You might have lost count, he asked. Before she could reply, the doctor continued his inquiry with a somewhat insincere note of politeness. But how was retirement, anyway?
I tried beekeeping,
Romana replied with a rueful smile. And how did that go?
They died.
Romana replied with the faintest of pouts. Ah, a shame. They do seem to have a habit of doing that. Romana nodded in agreement.
It was quite demoralizing.
No doubt. But I can't imagine that was what brought you out of retirement. Why are you here? And how are you here? Romana cocked her head and allowed the barest expression of reproval to flash across her features.
Well, it is hard to stay retired when someone breaks the universe.
The doctor became indignant. How dare you suggest I did this? Romana wagged a finger at the doctor.
I never said you did,
she began, before nodding towards one of the view screens on the TARDIS main console.
But your own instruments seem to suggest a very strong connection, whatever that may be.
The doctor turned his back on her, hiding his features. His voice, when next he spoke, sounded aloof. And how did you get here?
Ah, well, when I retired, I took one of the office supplies with me. In this case, my own personal TARDIS.
And how did that bring you into my TARDIS? It's not like you parked it inside mine, the doctor asked, his back still turned.
Oh no, my TARDIS is still at home. And fortunately, my home just happened to occupy the same space-time fragment as you and your TARDIS. I just got my TARDIS to make a one-way, side-to-side time transport directly here. At some point, I suppose I shall have to ask you for a lift home.
The doctor wheeled round to face Romana, his eyes wide. A TARDIS can't do that! He exclaimed incredulously, arms raised. Romana glanced at the ceiling, thumb and forefinger upon her chin in contemplation.
I'm not entirely sure you are correct there, Doctor. I mean, all TARDISes contain the raw power for such an operation. However, a veteran vehicle such as this Type 40 would no doubt require significant modification and additional equipment installed to effect such a feat. My TARDIS is somewhat more, up-to-date. It has the necessary circuits as standard.
Romana finished, not entirely successfully covering her smugness. Up-to-date, the doctor muttered. With so many additional features, it's no doubt cleverer than the driver. Oh, not you, of course, he added hurriedly. I mean, Time Lords fresh from the Academy. Their greatest mechanical challenge is telling their TARDIS to run a self-diagnostic and repair program. Romana tutted and shook her head.
Now you really are sounding old.
The doctor batted this statement away with a wave of his hand. Bah! I've only just regenerated. I feel as fresh as a daisy. The doctor took a step towards Romana and looked her in the eye. I know how to fix this, he said, utterly serious, all bluster and pretense now evaporated. Romana spoke more kindly now.
I never doubted it for a second.
The doctor nodded.
We need to find the weakest point in the universe, the widest breach,
Romana told the doctor. He shook his head. We need to find my four-dimensional stress set, the doctor announced gravely.
Your what?
Romana cried. My four-dimensional stress set, FDSS for short. It's a multi-dimensional toolkit, very powerful, too powerful in fact, the doctor said, stroking his chin, looking troubled. Which is why I don't have it anymore. Romana threw up her hands in exasperation.
If it is so useful, why on Gallifrey don't you have it anymore?
The doctor stared at Romana long and hard before answering. Oh yes, it's very useful. It could find the weakest point in a fractured or broken universe. It could find the source of such an injury, which is what we actually need it for. It could also force a break in the universe wider still. Might make it possible to explore beyond the confines of our own universe, beyond the confines of four dimensions themselves.
But why don't you have it?
Romana interrupted. The doctor appeared to ignore her question and carried on with his tale. It was indeed to break through the limitations of space-time travel that I first built it, in my hubris. Then I realized that the most likely outcome of such a forced journey beyond our universe would almost certainly be to tear it irreparably. Quite a price to pay for a one-way ticket.
But...
Romana began hesitantly.
But you don't have to use it for that purpose. It could be used for searching and repair, as you said earlier?
The doctor nodded. Of course. But the temptations, my dear, oh, they were far too great. So I dismantled it, split it, and sent the parts far away from me, out of sight, out of mind. Romana frowned.
But you know where they are,
she asked. The doctor coughed and looked a little shifty. Well, I know where one of them is. Probably. Assuming it hasn't been destroyed. Romana rolled her eyes.
That's a start, I suppose. Couldn't we just build another FDSS?
The doctor shook his head. No, I destroyed the plans. My memory is hazy on the design too, for some reason, possibly self-inflicted. And even as Time Lords, due to the peculiarities of multidimensional catastrophes, we, in our own terms, simply do not have the time. Romana sighed. Then she brightened and clapped her hands.
Right then. I guess we'll just have to strike out for the first piece. Where did you say it was?
She asked. I didn't, the doctor responded before walking to the main console and setting several levers and switches. But we are ready to go. Romana shrugged, then casually asked,
Doctor, do you know the source of this catastrophe?
The doctor had been reaching for the launch lever but froze. His expression could not be read, and he remained still for several seconds. We shall find it, he eventually said, and threw the lever. The TARDIS stood atop a shallow hill, looking down upon a village graveyard, next to a time-worn and weather-beaten Norman church. Beyond the graveyard ran a tarmacked road, once leading to the village's main thoroughfare, now just an exit on the A7665, leading to exotic lands beyond the church itself. The doctor stood staring intently at one short gravestone, unmoving. Romana stood patiently and respectfully by his side. The stone itself was new, pink granite, and at its base somebody had recently left a bouquet of yellow daffodils. The engraving upon its surface was still bright and sharp. Time had yet to touch the name spelled out there. It read, Sarah Jane Smith. After a while, Romana gently broke the silence.
She was very important to you, wasn't she?
The doctor did not reply for several seconds, the setting and mood seeming to stretch them to eternity. At last he responded. She was my assistant, he said coldly, shooting Romana a sidelong glance. They all leave in the end.
Oh, so I am an assistant now, am I?
Romana asked with gentle mockery, tinged by sympathy. Well, are you helping or not? The doctor snapped back, his eyes never leaving the gravestone. In an uncharacteristic show of empathy, Romana reached out and touched the doctor's forearm.
I'm here, aren't I?
She softly reassured. The doctor remained silent, and yet something in the air seemed to soften, his continued silence a mute acknowledgement and acceptance. The road outside the cemetery meandered up the lower slopes of that same hill the TARDIS now dominated, and Romana pointed along it to attract the doctor's attention.
We're being watched.
Beyond Romana's outstretched hand, perhaps 100 meters along the road, past the cemetery gate, sat a lone biker, clad from head to foot in form-fitting black leather. An equally black helmet covered her face, and it was indeed a she. The form-fitting outfit made that much plain enough. However, the anonymity of the figure was further cemented by the black-tinted visor of the helmet. The doctor did not look towards the stranger, his vigil of the grave continuing, but he nodded his head backwards to indicate behind them. We practically have an audience, he said calmly. Romana spun round to look back. This happened to be the direction of the pretty wooden entrance gate. Framed by this rustic timber portico stood a young man on the opposite side of the road. He shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, and had clearly been watching them, but had looked away awkwardly as Romana had turned to face him. In spite of his seeming reluctance to meet her gaze, his expression was one of confusion and conflict. Even now he still glanced occasionally in their direction.
I think he wants to talk to us,
Romana reported. Naturally, the doctor replied airily. With that, he finally broke free from the headstone, turned and strode towards the gate. Romana, caught by surprise, was forced to trot a few paces to catch up, before falling into step at his side. Together they walked through the gate and into the road, heading straight for the young man. At that moment they both heard the roaring whine of a motorbike approaching at high speed. Suddenly the doctor found himself on his back, Romana sprawled over him. They felt the wind as the bike screamed past mere inches from their prone forms, and in front of the startled face of the man. Romana raised her head from the doctor's shoulder, looking him in the eye before laughing heartily.
Just like old times.
she cried, still laughing. The doctor's brow furrowed. I don't recall anything exactly like that happening before. Romana shrugged and got up, offering her hand in aid to the doctor.
Maybe, but the spirit is familiar,
she said cheerily. The doctor accepted her hand and allowed her to help haul him to his feet. He brushed himself down tetchily, then marched over to face the waiting man. Hello, Clyde, he said, extending his hand. Been waiting long? Clyde looked shocked and stared at the hand for a long moment as if it were a halibut. Then he grasped it in both hands and shook it vigorously. Doctor, Clyde gasped. It really is you, isn't it? You look so much, different. The doctor afforded Clyde his best imitation of a reassuring smile as the young man finally released his hand. Oh, come now, Clyde. This isn't the first time you've seen me change face. Clyde shrugged. Yeah, I know. Still weirds me out a little. The doctor shrugged in return. You change face too, you know. You look a little, different too. Clyde's manner visibly slumped a little as the reason he was here flooded back to mind. It has been 8 years, to the day, since we lost her, he said, staring past the doctor to the graveyard beyond. I come here every year, he continued sadly, on the day she died. Clyde almost choked on these words, but he steeled himself and found the strength to continue with only the briefest pause. I always leave her daffodils. She loved them, you know. The doctor nodded. I know. So that's why you're here. You weren't waiting for me. Clyde frowned. No, not for you. But I did always wonder if, of all the days in a year, this might be where you'd show yourself again. And then today, as I was leaving the cemetery, I heard it, the blue box. I saw you two come out, wanted to run over right away, but something inside said, wait, give him his time. So I just hung here, till you were ready. The doctor looked again at the young man with an appraising eye. Thank you, Clyde. A genuine, simple statement of gratitude. Seeing an opportune pause in the conversation, Romana stuck her own hand towards Clyde.
We haven't been properly introduced. My name is Romana Dvoratna Lundar.
Clyde looked confused, but took her hand and shook it. The doctor gave a sidelong glance to Romana before saying, You can call her Fred. Where is K9? He asked suddenly in a jarring change of tack. Clyde once again looked shocked. How did you know? He asked incredulously. Know what? The doctor responded. Well, you must be here because of him, surely. Luke phoned me just before you arrived saying K9 had gone crazy, saying over and over that the breach had reopened and that he must be sent in to fix it. So Luke released him into the Black Hole wall safe and had just booked a flight to Geneva to try and investigate the source of the trouble. What have they done to open the Black Hole rift again? Clyde asked wearily.
The rift has nothing to do with Geneva,
Romana began, but the doctor held up a finger to prevent her revealing more details. Instead, he asked Clyde, How did you get to Foxgrove Cemetery? Clyde spread his hands. Train to Hartford, then Uber. The doctor nodded. Well, I think we can do a little better than that in terms of transport. I think it's time you took a trip in the TARDIS. Clyde agreed with little show of emotion. Then his eyes widened as a realization slowly dawned on him. You mean, you want me to travel with you? The doctor smiled slightly. That's what taking a trip in the TARDIS usually entails, he said levelly. Together, the three companions returned to the cemetery and trudged up the hill to the blue police box. The doctor threw open both doors, somewhat theatrically, an obvious invitation for Clyde to enter. Clyde took a couple of steps over the threshold, then froze in place, looking slowly around the scene before him. The doctor watched him with narrow-eyed curiosity, wondering how the young man would express his thoughts. Finally, Clyde turned his head to look at the doctor. It all looks so different, he said simply. The doctor gave a mirthless chuckle. You mean older? Clyde looked confused. No, I don't think so. Just very different. Romana gave a slight giggle.
Shall we spend the rest of the day on the doorstep discussing decor?
She asked mischievously. The doctor harumphed before grabbing each of his assistants by their upper arms and propelling them inside. The doors whirred closed behind them. Before a modest suburban townhouse in Ealing, there stretched a short, unoccupied driveway. Then it was occupied. Now once again deserted. And again filled with content. Then vacant once more. Finally, it settled down to very definitely in use. The police box door swung open, and the three faces of Clyde, Romana, and the doctor peered through the gap. Then the doctor straightened his back and walked boldly forth. Romana glided easily after him, and finally Clyde jogged out to catch up with the Time Lords. The doctor tried the front door handle, but it failed to open. The doctor sighed, his head dropping slightly, before reaching aside his jacket to retrieve the sonic screwdriver. Romana raised an eyebrow.
My, that does look familiar. Very retro. You do seem to be retreading a lot of old ground lately,
she said, barely covering a smirk. Not by choice, the doctor grumbled.
Oh.
Romana responded.
Who gave it to you?
The doctor clenched his jaw and ground his teeth. I did, he growled at her. Upon hearing this, Romana raised both eyebrows and spread her hands in a vaguely pacifying gesture. All the while she was swallowing the urge to laugh. The device now chirruped in the doctor's hand, and there was a click from the door. The doctor pushed it wide open. Ta-da! The doctor said wearily, without any trace of enthusiasm. We need to go up to the attic, Clyde told the others. That's where the portal is. To the black hole rift, I mean.
Then lead on, friend Clyde,
Romana prompted.
Take us to the black hole rift.
Clyde did not notice the somewhat sarcastic emphasis Romana had placed on the words black hole. It had not gone unnoticed by the doctor, however, who glowered once more at Romana. Nothing was said, though, as they made their way through the house and up to the attic. The attic itself looked much as it had always done. It was littered with strange alien artifacts of unknown origin or design, the walls covered in articles and pictures relating to the Doctor, or Unit, or other aspects of Sarah Jane's extraordinary life. There were even one or two rare artifacts which could be directly linked to the Doctor himself. Clyde walked over to what appeared to be a wall safe and entered the combination necessary to break the seal. He pulled back the heavy hatch to reveal a strange scene of swirling fiery orange and purest black. It did indeed seem that they were looking at the heated material in the inner layers of an accretion disk surrounding a black hole. The Doctor suddenly became very alert and pointed wide-eyed towards a distant patch of glowing gas. Between the Doctor and the disk itself, still some way distant from the hatch, a tiny man-made object could be seen. While obviously artificial, it equally obviously bore features which were unmistakably dog-like. K9! The Doctor shouted joyously, pointing and waving. The thinnest of metallic voices drifted to the watching companions. Master? It asked faintly. K9, come here! Clyde shouted, beckoning just inside the open hatch. We need you! Come to us! With these last words, Clyde turned back to face Romana and the Doctor. At that moment, unseen by Clyde, but fully visible to the two Time Lords, a dark shadow seemed to pass between the hatch and the scene beyond. It only took a moment before the scene returned to normal, but it was more than enough time to turn the Doctor's expression from one of joy to abject horror. Clyde! The Doctor whispered hoarsely. Come over here, away from the safe. Clyde laughed. Don't be daft, Doctor, Clyde said reassuringly. The black hole is way too far off to affect anything here. At that moment, something vast and hideous snaked through the opening. It was tentacle-like, and had an eerie property such that light, and indeed even the eyes, seemed unable to fix properly upon it. Its colour was therefore uncertain, sometimes seeming a glistening brown, sometimes scaly green, and at other times, in brief flashes, crystalline in rainbow hues. In a second it had wrapped itself around Clyde like a python. It was clear now that this tentacle was merely the tip of the iceberg, and the bulk of this unspeakable horror still lay beyond the hatch and out of view. Clyde gave one single blood-curdling scream as he was yanked through the hatch and disappeared. As this was happening, the Doctor dragged Romana behind a nearby desk and pulled them both down behind it. They peeked now over the top of the furniture to warily regard the still open safe. Romana was fully aware of just how pitiful a defence the desk provided. She leaned closer to the Doctor's ear.
Are we safe?
She whispered. The Doctor turned to look her directly in the eyes. There was no comfort to be found in his next words. No one is safe. Romana's eyes widened a little at this.
What about Clyde?
She asked. The Doctor's eyes never left hers, and his grim expression remained unchanged. Clyde is gone. Romana shivered.
What was that thing?
She hissed. The doctor broke his gaze from hers and returned to staring at the portal. A creature of the bulk, he said. Romana's nose furrowed and her lips curled in disgust, seeming to physically reject the implications of his words.
What are you saying?
Was all she could manage to utter. A creature of the bulk, the doctor repeated. An entity whose multidimensional existence spans the bulk of dimensions, of which our four are just a tiny slice. Entities whose very concept of space and time, even thought itself, would be utterly alien to us. All we saw was an extrusion of its higher dimensional body into our unremarkable, paltry, four-dimensional plane. Who knows what it thought of the experience, what its aims were, even assuming such notions as aims, thoughts, or senses had any meaning to it. Romana shook her head slowly, forcing herself to assimilate and accept the doctor's words. Finally she looked up, saying,
Do you think it saw us? Was it aware of us?
The doctor looked directly at her once again. Pray it did not. Romana gave a nervous and largely humourless laugh.
Ha! Come now, Doctor, we are Time Lords. We have no need for prayer nor belief in gods.
The doctor continued to stare at her. Funny you should say that, he responded coldly, given you just saw one. Romana could not respond, and just looked back and forth between the doctor and the still open portal. The doctor now stood up.
Doctor!
Romana cried in muted tones.
What are you doing?
The doctor looked down at her. K9 is still out there. We need him. We need to bring him home. The doctor walked out from behind the desk and began to tread, cautiously and quietly, towards the square patch of swirling fire and darkness. With obvious reluctance, Romana also rose and crept behind the doctor. She caught hold of the back of his jacket at its base, almost as if it were a lifeline. The doctor paused for a moment and looked back at her, but did not pull his jacket free, allowing himself to be so tethered. Together they advanced once more towards the opening. Now there was nothing between the doctor and whatever lurked beyond. K9 was still visible at approximately the same position he had been before they lost Clyde. The doctor wondered momentarily whether, if he called out to K9, some higher dimensional entity might hear and snatch him away in an instant. He mused again on whether these creatures even had any comparable sense which would operate in this restricted, lower-dimensional existence, or if these beings were in fact sentient. Were they aware, in any real or at least four-dimensional sense? Then he kicked himself for his stupidity. There was no sound to carry between himself and K9. It was, after all, mostly the vacuum of space. The portal must contain a transmitter and receiver for communication with K9. K9, can you hear me? He asked to thin air. In spite of the reassuringly excellent rationale as to his safety he had just constructed, he discovered he was still whispering. Affirmative, Master, came back the faint reply. Whatever the means of transmission, the distance had clearly still attenuated the signal. K9, listen very carefully. Yes, Master. I want you to fly back to the portal as fast as you can, but... And here he stressed this last word to forestall K9 prematurely executing his instruction. I want you to do it causing as little disturbance as possible. Disturbance, Master? Came back the confused reply. Oh, you know, K9. Fly casual, the doctor suggested with exasperation. Flying casually, Master, K9 affirmed. It was clear now that K9 was indeed increasing his size as he rapidly approached the open hatch. However, as he neared the safe door, yet still at a distance of about 10 meters, it became clear he was slowing considerably and having some difficulty. Master? What is it, K9? Uncertain, Master. I seem to be having trouble finding traction. There are unusually strong currents. Eddies in the space-time continuum. Is he? The doctor growled softly, all the while looking around for signs of incursions. Master? K9 asked, perplexed.
K9, push! Push harder, you have to get closer,
came Romana's encouragement. Over the comlink, noises began to emanate, presumably from K9. Whirring and unhealthy grinding noises. Simultaneously, many of K9's lights began to flash, while several instruments and devices began to pop in and out with the strain. K9 had managed to approach within 6 feet of the door when suddenly a vast dark shadow passed between him and the doctor. Romana tugged sharply on the doctor's jacket, sending them both reeling backwards onto their backsides, a couple of feet from the open safe. The doctor felt around him for anything which might be of use in the myriad artifacts strewn around the attic. He found fabric beneath his hand. The dark shape seemed to be moving far more slowly and deliberately than the first time they had seen it, just before Clyde had been taken. K9 was still hidden from view. Finally, the shape moved on, and K9 was visible once more. The doctor threw himself forward, and halfway through the hatch, Romana rushed forward to grab his legs and prevent him from flying through entirely. The doctor flung the piece of cloth he had found towards K9, keeping tight hold of one end. At least 10 feet of fabric arced at the metal dog, falling across his head and snagging in his fully extended nose laser. Swiftly, the doctor pulled hand over hand, rapidly dragging K9 to him. Just as the doctor grabbed K9's body, the dark shape returned, immediately behind K9, terrifyingly and oppressively close. Something struck the back of K9, pushing him and the doctor back through the portal to land on Romana. Muttering an apology, the doctor leapt to his feet and slammed the hatch on the creature of the bulk, spinning the tumblers to seal it once more. He then turned, leaning his back against it and wrapping the rest of the colourful scarf around K9's neck and body, covering him almost entirely. "Thank you, Master." Whether K9 was referring to the rescue or the scarf was unclear. The doctor then slid slowly down the hatch to sit, his back against the wall beneath it, panting gently. Romana crawled over and adopted the same position next to him, shoulder to shoulder.
"Well, that's that then,"
she gasped, smiling. The doctor turned his head to look at her, his face screwed up, making no attempt to hide his feelings towards the statement. "Romana, sometimes I wonder if you listen to me at all." Romana withdrew a white handkerchief, a very ornate R embroidered upon it, from her sleeve, and began to gently mop her brow.
"My dear doctor, whatever do you mean?"
she asked innocently. However, by now the doctor had become distracted by the handkerchief. "I didn't realize you had acquired a logo these days," he said, nodding towards the R. Romana rolled her eyes.
"You're a fine one to talk. I seem to remember you having a fixation with question marks for quite some time."
The doctor sniffed airily. "I have no idea what you're talking about. No recollection whatsoever." Romana chuckled.
"Of course you don't. Anyway, why is it you think I don't listen?"
The doctor's tone suddenly darkened. "We just lost Clyde," he began. "You just saw a creature of the bulk. The damage to the universe is already serious enough to allow them some access to the fragments, including the one we inhabit. And this is only going to get worse." The doctor now stood up and offered his hand to Romana, who took it and allowed herself to be pulled up to face him. "And you say, well, that's that then," he continued seriously, "when we have hardly begun. And that's all the more unfortunate, given the end is so near.